On the morning of November 27, 2017, a 68-year-old woman was walking along a beach near the city of Oga on the northwestern coast of Japan when she saw a wooden boat that had not been there the day before. It was small, about 7 meters long, flat-bottomed, painted in colors that had faded to gray under salt and sun. It had been thrown up onto the sand by the winter surf and lay tilted on its side, battered and broken, missing part of its propeller. The woman walked closer. Later, she would tell rescue workers that she was surprised to see the boat in such bad condition, that it looked as though it had been at sea for a very long time. Then she looked inside, and she stopped walking. There were people in the boat. Or there had been. What was left of them had been reduced, in places, to bone. 8 bodies, some still partly clothed, some little more than skeletons, lying in the wreckage of a fishing boat that had drifted across one of the coldest and roughest seas on Earth and come to rest on a Japanese beach with no one alive aboard to explain how it got there. The boat carried no names, no registration, no papers, but the investigators who examined it found the things these boats always carry. Bare light bulbs, the kind strung up to attract squid at night, a cigarette box printed with Korean letters, and on some of these vessels, a small badge stamped with the faces of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the founders of the North Korean state, worn over the heart the way every adult in North Korea is required to wear it. The men in the boat had come from North Korea, more than 600 miles away. They had gone to sea to catch squid, and the sea had kept them. And then the sea had carried their bodies to a country they had never been allowed to visit while they were alive. This was not a single tragedy. It was one boat in a fleet of them. In 2017 alone, 104 of these boats washed up on the shores of Japan. They have a name in Japan. They are called the ghost ships, and they have been arriving, year after year, for over a decade. To understand the ghost ships, you have to understand where they come from and why anyone would sail a boat like that into the open sea in winter. North Korea is one of the most isolated and impoverished nations on Earth. Its people have endured famine, chronic food shortages, and a state that prioritizes its military and its leadership over the basic survival of its citizens. Fish is one of the few sources of cheap protein available to ordinary North Koreans, and it is also one of the few things the country can export to China for hard currency. Under Kim Jong-un, the regime has pushed its fishing industry to produce more, setting quotas and applying pressure that flows all the way down to the men in the boats. The problem is that North Korea's own coastal waters have been fished out. In a series of deals, the North Korean government sold fishing rights in its own waters to Chinese companies. By 2017, an estimated 900 Chinese vessels were operating in those waters. Large modern industrial ships that scooped up the squid and the crab and the sandfish in quantities that left little behind. The Chinese fleet caught more than 160,000 metric tons of Pacific flying squid in a single year, more than Japan and South Korea combined. The fish that North Korean fishermen had always relied on close to shore were simply gone, taken by foreign ships their own government had invited in. So the North Korean fishermen had a choice that was not really a choice. They could come back with empty boats and face the consequences of missing their quotas in a country that does not forgive failure, or they could sail further out, far beyond the safe coastal waters, into the open sea of Japan, chasing the squid that had retreated into deep and dangerous water. They chose to sail out. They had to. and the boats they sailed out in were death traps. These were not modern fishing vessels. They were small wooden boats, often no more than 10 meters long, with weak engines or no functioning engine at all. They had no GPS. They had no radar. They had no radio capable of calling for help across hundreds of miles of ocean. They had no modern navigation equipment of any kind. Many of them were so poorly built and so poorly maintained that they were barely seaworthy in calm conditions, let alone in the winter storms of one of the roughest seas in the world. The men aboard navigated by sight and by experience, and when the weather turned, or the engine failed, or the wind pushed them too far from shore, they had no way to get back, and no way call for rescue. To picture one of these boats is to understand why so many of them never came home. They are flat-bottomed, designed for relatively calm coastal water, not for the open sea. The wood is often rough and unpainted, or painted in colors that have long since faded. Strung along the deck are rows of bare light bulbs, powered by a small generator, used to attract squid to the surface at night. That is the whole technology of the operation: wood, an unreliable engine, and a string of light bulbs. There is no enclosed wheelhouse to shelter the crew from the wind. There is no survival equipment worth the name. When the Japanese Coast Guard examines these boats, they routinely find them missing their propeller blades, missing their rudders, missing any device that could tell a sailor where he was or which way was home. These were boats built for a short trip close to shore, sent instead on a voyage into deep ocean that they were never designed to survive. The men who crewed them were not professional deep-sea sailors. They were ordinary North Koreans, some of them fishermen by trade, some of them soldiers, some of them simply men assigned to bring back a catch. They went out in groups of a handful to a dozen. They wore the clothes they owned, not specialized cold-weather gear. They carried what food and water they could, which was never enough for the weeks they would end up adrift. And every one of them knew, on some level, that the boats were dangerous and the waters were deadly, because the ghost ships had been washing up in Japan for years, and the story would have reached even the closed world of a North Korean fishing village. They went anyway. They had no choice. The Sea of Japan in winter is merciless. The easterly winds race across the water at high speed, driving the surf into pounding breakers. The temperature drops. Storms roll through one after another. A small wooden boat caught out in that, with a dead engine and no navigation, becomes a leaf on the water. The wind and the powerful currents of the sea take hold of it and push it east, away from Korea, across hundreds of miles of open ocean, toward the long northwestern coast of Japan. The journey takes weeks. The men aboard, if they survived the storm that disabled their boat, did not survive the weeks that followed. They had little food. They had little fresh water. They had no shelter from the cold beyond the thin wooden walls of the boat. They died slowly, of exposure, of thirst, of starvation, drifting east the entire time, already dead or dying long before their boats reached the country that would eventually find them. The numbers tell the story of a worsening crisis. In 2013, the Japanese Coast Guard recorded around 80 of these ghost boats. In 2016, 66. Then in 2017, the number jumped to 104, a record, with at least 35 bodies recovered from the boats that year. In November of 2017 alone, 28 ghost ships were detected, compared to just 4 in November of the previous year. The surge was so sudden and so alarming that Japanese authorities stepped up coastal patrols, bracing for what the winter would bring. The phenomenon has continued in the years since, with dozens of boats arriving each winter, sometimes empty, sometimes carrying the dead. By November of 2018, 89 boats had already washed ashore. The autumn and winter of 2017 produced a string of arrivals so relentless that they blur together into a single, grim chronicle. On the 15th of November, 3 North Koreans were rescued by the Japanese Coast Guard off the Noto Peninsula. The following day, 3 dead bodies were found on their boat. On the 17th, 4 more dead bodies were discovered aboard another boat that washed ashore in the same area. On the 23rd, 8 North Koreans were rescued alive after their boat came ashore in Akita Prefecture. 4 days later, on the 27th, the 8 skeletons were found at Oga. In the span of 2 weeks, on one stretch of coast, the sea delivered living men, freshly dead men, and men reduced to bone, in boat after boat after boat. The Coast Guard could barely keep up with the arrivals. No one could fully explain why 2017 was so much worse than the years before it. Some Japanese officials pointed to the weather, noting that a harsher winter in the Sea of Japan simply produces more shipwrecks. Others pointed to Kim Jong-un's intensified campaign to boost the fish harvest, which pushed more boats out, further out, more often. Still others pointed to the Chinese fishing fleet, which had stripped the coastal waters bare and forced the North Koreans into the deep. The truth is probably all of these at once. More boats sent further into emptier water, under more pressure, in worse weather, with no better equipment than they had ever had. The result was a record harvest of the dead. What makes the ghost ships so unsettling is not just the scale, it is the way they arrive. They come in with the winter weather, pushed onto the beaches by the same storms that killed their crews. Usually it is only the boat, or pieces of the boat, that wash ashore. Sometimes it is the boat with the bodies still inside. The bodies are almost always badly decomposed because they have been at sea for weeks, exposed to the cold and the salt and the scavengers. In the worst cases, like the boat at Oga, the remains have been reduced to skeletons. Japanese police, Coast Guard officers, and local residents have found themselves repeatedly confronted with the same grim scene. A broken wooden boat on their beach, and inside it, the remains of men who starved or froze to death somewhere out on the water and were delivered to their doorstep by the current. In January of 2018, a boat washed up in Kanazawa, in central Japan. Inside its small rooms, investigators found the decomposed bodies of 7 men. An 8th body was found about 15 meters away on the beach, where the surf had carried it. The boat held a tobacco box with Korean writing and a badge depicting the North Korean leaders. The senior police official who examined the scene said simply that it was difficult to identify the bodies because they had begun to decompose. Rough seas and bad weather delayed the investigation for days. This was the first confirmed ghost ship of 2018. It would not be the last. That detail, the badge, is worth pausing on. In North Korea, every adult is required to wear a small pin over the heart, bearing the faces of the country's late leaders. It is a mandatory symbol of loyalty, worn every day, never removed in public. To find one of these badges in the wreckage of a ghost ship is to find the last trace of the system that sent these men to their deaths. They died chasing squid to meet a quota set by the state, whose founders they were required to wear over their hearts, and that badge drifted across the sea with their bodies and came to rest on a foreign beach, still pinned, in some cases, to the clothing of a skeleton. It is one of the most haunting objects the ghost ships carry, a small enameled portrait of the men ultimately responsible for the empty boat it arrived in. The phrase the investigators used, that the bodies were found in the boat's small rooms, is also worth sitting with. These tiny wooden boats had cramped compartments below the open deck, spaces barely large enough to crawl into, where a man might shelter from the wind and the freezing spray. In their final days adrift, as the cold and the hunger took hold, the crews would have crawled into those small rooms to try to stay warm, pressed together in the dark. And that is where they died. And that is where, weeks later, they were found. The boats are, in the most literal sense, floating coffins, the men sealed inside the spaces they crawled into to survive. Sometimes the sea is not entirely cruel. Sometimes the men are still alive when they are found. In November 2017, just days before the 8 skeletons were discovered at Oga, a wooden boat washed up at Yorihonjo in the same Akita prefecture, carrying 8 men who were alive and in reasonably good health. They told the Japanese authorities that they were North Korean fishermen who had been fishing for squid when their boat ran into difficulties and drifted into Japanese waters. They were rescued, cared for, and eventually returned to North Korea. The contrast is almost unbearable. 2 boats, the same waters, the same week. On one, 8 living men who made it. On another, 8 skeletons who did not. The only difference between them was how long they had been adrift, and whether the storm that took them came early enough to kill them before the current brought them in. There is an important and painful detail in the stories of the survivors. Most of them are not defectors. They are not trying to escape to Japan. When they are rescued, the majority of them ask to be returned to North Korea, and they are. They have families there. They have homes there. They have, in many cases, no concept of leaving, because the regime they live under has made the outside world into something feared rather than desired. These are not people fleeing toward a better life. They are workers who went out to do a job their government demanded of them, and who got caught by the sea, and who want nothing more than to go home. The ghost ships are not a story of escape. They are a story of labor and poverty, and a state that sends its people out to die for a quota of squid. Some of the boats raise darker questions. A number of the vessels appear to be operated by the North Korean military, or rented from the army by civilian crews. Some carry markings or equipment that suggest a connection to the state beyond simple fishing. North Korea's relationship with the sea is tangled up with smuggling, with sanctions evasion, with the shadowy traffic that keeps the regime's economy alive. But the great majority of the ghost ships are exactly what they appear to be: the boats of poor fishermen, pushed too far out by desperation and a depleted sea, killed by the weather, and carried to Japan by currents that do not care about borders, politics, or the difference between a living man and a dead one. For the people of Japan's northwestern coast, the ghost ships have become a grim feature of winter. The communities along that shore are mostly small fishing towns and quiet beaches. Each winter, the residents know that the wind and the current may bring them something they do not want to find: a boat, a body, or 8 of them. Local authorities have had to develop procedures for handling the arrivals, securing the boat, recovering the remains, attempting identification, and arranging, through diplomatic channels, for the bodies to be returned to North Korea when possible. It is solemn, repetitive, and almost entirely thankless work. The boats keep coming, the bodies keep coming, and there is nothing anyone in Japan can do to stop them, because the cause lies across the sea, in a country that does not explain itself and does not account for its dead. The ghost ships are different from almost every other story the sea tells. There is no single mystery here, no one vanished vessel to investigate, no famous name. There is something worse: a pattern. A steady, year after year, delivery of the dead, Each boat its own small catastrophe, each one carrying men who had names and families and villages, men who were sent out onto the water by forces beyond their control and who never came back. The sea did not single them out. It simply took what was sent to it, and what was sent to it, every winter, was a fleet of failing wooden boats crewed by men who had no realistic chance of returning. We do not know most of their names. The North Korean government does not release them, does not acknowledge the losses, does not in most cases even claim the bodies until quietly pressed through diplomatic back channels. The men who wash up on Japan's beaches are buried or cremated as unidentified remains, or returned across the sea to a state that treats them as an embarrassment rather than a tragedy. They go into the ground without names, in a foreign country, having died on the water in boats their own government sent them out in. The squid they were chasing was worth more to that government than they were. Every winter, the wind picks up on the northwestern coast of Japan. The surf begins to pound, and somewhere out on the dark water of the Sea of Japan, a small wooden boat with a dead engine and a dead crew turns slowly in the current and begins its long drift east, toward a beach where, in a few weeks, someone walking in the cold will look down and see it and understand, before they even look inside, what they have found. The sea keeps sending them. Japan keeps finding them. And North Korea keeps sending its fishermen out to chase a catch that is no longer there, in boats that cannot bring them home. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There's always another ship that never came home.